The scent of turpentine and linseed oil hangs heavy in the still air of this southern room. Sunlight filters through the shutters, catching dust motes that drift like tiny, suspended islands in the golden haze. I stand here long before the figure arrives, watching the light shift across the rough, hewn wooden floorboards. The silence is deep, broken only by the distant, rhythmic breathing of the sea beyond the walls. A small clay jar sits on the table, filled with dried lavender that has lost its color but keeps its sharp, herbal perfume. The shadows stretch long and thin as the afternoon wears on, painting the stone walls in shades of ochre and faded blue. This quiet is different from the silence before a charge, a quiet that has no tension, no waiting for the drumbeat to start. It is the silence of a life that has finally found its rest after decades of running. The wind whispers through the cracks in the shutters, carrying the faint, salty breath of the Mediterranean. It is a gentle sound, far removed from the roar of elephants and the clash of bronze on iron. I remember the smell of dry grass and warm stone, a scent that has remained unchanged for centuries across these hills. The clouds drift slowly across the pale blue sky, their shapes shifting with a languid grace that demands no attention. Water flows quietly in a small stone channel nearby, its surface reflecting the warm hues of the setting sun. The scene is one of perfect stillness, a moment frozen in time for those who care to look. Colors of the landscape blend together in a soft harmony that soothes the weary mind. It is a place where the world seems to pause, allowing thoughts to settle into a quiet rhythm. The beauty of the moment requires no explanation, existing simply as a gift to the senses. Shadows lengthen further as the day draws to a close, wrapping the land in a gentle embrace. The air grows cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming jasmine from a nearby garden. This peaceful interlude offers respite from the chaos of history, a space for quiet reflection. The landscape stands as a silent witness to the passage of time, unchanged by the wars of men. It remains a constant presence, offering comfort to all who walk its paths in search of peace. The stillness of the scene invites the observer to breathe deeply and let go of all tension. In this quiet corner of the world, the past and present merge into a single, serene moment. The gentle movement of the leaves and the soft flow of water create a natural lullaby for the soul. The general who once shook the foundations of Rome now rests in a small town called Labissa. He sought refuge here from Roman agents who hunted him across the eastern Mediterranean for decades. The year 182 BCE marked the end of his journey, a quiet conclusion to a life defined by movement and strategic brilliance. His suicide ensured that he would never be paraded through the streets of the city he once threatened. The political displacement he experienced shaped his final, years of exile in this peaceful corner of Bithynia. He remained a significant figure even as Carthage lost its power to the rising Roman Empire. His influence on the eastern Mediterranean politics was undeniable during this turbulent period. The Romans could not rest until he was removed from the board, fearing his name long after his body turned to dust. The slow fate of his life mirrored the slow decline of his city, yet his name remained etched in the annals of military history. The quiet end in a small town contrasted with his dramatic life of crossing mountains and leading armies. History recorded his name with a mixture of fear and admiration that has lasted for 2 millennia. The fall of Carthage was a direct result of his earlier conquests that stretched the Roman state to its breaking point. His story served as a warning to those who challenged the might of Rome for generations. The legacy of Hannibal Barca endured long after his physical death in the cold soil of Asia Minor. Scholars continue to study his tactics and his political maneuvers today with the same fascination as ancient historians. A lyre drifts from a tent where a bard sang of ancient heroes and forgotten battles in the distance. The stars begin to appear in the deepening blue sky, watching silently over the sleeping army of memory. This quiet moment of peace is a rare respite from the constant preparation for war that defined his existence. The general spent his early years in Spain, mastering the art of war and consolidating his. The memory of that day is as sharp as the blade of a sword. I was 9 years old. Standing in the shadow of the great temples of Carthage, the air thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of the crowd, my father, Hannibal Barca, stood before the altar of Baal, his face a mask of solemn resolve. The Romans had taken our lands in Sicily, our ships, our pride. The peace we signed was not a peace of friendship, but a chain of iron that bound us to their will. Hamilcar did not speak of war then, not openly, but his eyes held a fire that burned hotter than the summer sun. He took my hand, his grip firm and unyielding, and led me to the altar. The priests chanted, their voices low and rhythmic, but I heard only the pounding of my own heart. "Swear," my father commanded, his voice cutting through the smoke. "Swear that you will never be a friend to Rome." The stone beneath my feet was cool and rough, worn smooth by centuries of feet walking the same path. I placed my hand upon the cold altar stone and felt the vibration of the earth beneath it. The words left my lips before I fully understood their weight. A promise spoken in a child's voice that would echo for decades. I felt the heat of the sun on my neck and the dry dust of the courtyard filling my mouth. The crowd watched in silence. A sea of faces turned toward the boy and the altar. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the high columns and the distant cry of a gull over the harbor. This oath became the foundation of my life. a constant presence in every decision I made from that moment forward. It was not a burden I carried with fear, but a compass that guided my steps through the darkest valleys of history. I learned early that preparation is the only true shield against the chaos of the world. Every map I studied, every terrain I walked, every strategy I devised was rooted in that single vow made in the dust of my childhood. The mind must be as flexible as water, yet as unyielding as the stone walls of the city. I saw how the Romans relied on their numbers and their rigid formations, and I knew I had to be different. I had to be the storm that breaks the dam, the shadow that slips through the cracks. My father taught me that tradition is a tool, not a master, and that the best plan is the one that adapts to the moment. He showed me that a general must see the world not as it is, but as it could be. I spent my youth walking the markets and the docks, listening to the stories of merchants and sailors. I learned the names of the winds and the currents, the taste of the salt spray, and the feel of the heavy wool sails. I watched the way the light hit the water at dawn and how the shadows fell across the hills at dusk. These small details were the threads from which I would weave the great tapestry of war. I did not wait for the call to action. I trained my body and my mind in the quiet hours before the sun rose. The discipline of the boy became the strength of the man. I walked the same paths where I once took the oath, tracing the route that would one day lead me across the mountains. I imagined the snow and the ice, the thin air and the steep cliffs. I saw the elephants in my mind, their massive forms moving slowly through the white silence. It was a dream that seemed impossible to others, but to me, it was a necessity. The world had drawn a line in the sand, and I had to find a way to step over it. I studied the maps of the Pyrenees and the Rhone, noting the rivers and the passes. I spoke with the guides who knew the mountains better than anyone else. I learned that the land itself could be an ally if one knew how to ask for its help. The terrain was not an obstacle, but a puzzle waiting to be solved. I saw the potential in the difficult paths, the advantage in the places others deemed impassable. My mind worked constantly, turning problems into solutions, turning fears into fuel. I did not rely on luck or the favor of the gods alone. I relied on the work of my hands and the clarity of my thoughts. The oath I took as a boy was not a promise of vengeance, but a promise of change. I wanted to reshape the world, to show that the strong could be challenged and the weak could rise. I wanted to prove that a single will could alter the course of history. The years that followed were a test of that promise, a long march through fire and ice. But the memory of that day in the temple remained clear, a bright point in the darkness. It reminded me why I walked the long road and why I faced the storm. It was the anchor that held me steady when The waves crashed against the hull of my life. The sun dipped low over the olive groves of the Italian countryside, casting long shadows across the rolling hills. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves, creating a soft rustling sound that filled the air. The light turned golden as it touched the ancient stone walls of a distant villa. A single bird called out from the branches of an old cypress tree, its song clear and steady. The earth smelled of dry grass and warm stone, a scent that had remained unchanged for centuries. Clouds drifted slowly across the pale blue sky, their shapes shifting with a languid grace. The silence of the afternoon was deep and comforting, broken only by the occasional chirp of an insect. Water flowed quietly in a small stone channel, its surface reflecting the warm hues of the setting sun. The scene was one of perfect stillness, a moment frozen in time for those who cared to look. The colors of the landscape blended together in a soft harmony that soothed the weary mind. It was a place where the world seemed to pause, allowing thoughts to settle into a quiet rhythm. The beauty of the moment required no explanation, existing simply as a gift to the senses. Shadows lengthened further as the day drew to a close, wrapping the land in a gentle embrace. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming jasmine from a nearby garden. This peaceful interlude offered a respite from the chaos of history, a space for quiet reflection. The landscape stood as a silent witness to the passage of time, unchanged by the wars of men. It remained a constant presence, offering comfort to all who walked its paths in search of peace. The stillness of the scene invited the observer to breathe deeply and let go of all tension. In this quiet corner of the world, the past and present merged into a single, serene moment. The gentle movement of the leaves and the soft flow of water created a natural lullaby for the soul. The lessons of that oath guided me through the crossing of the Pyrenees and the treacherous paths of the Alps. I led my army through snow and rock, facing the cold and the hunger with a calm that surprised even my own men. We moved like a river, finding the dust of the Iberian Peninsula settles into the creases of old skin, a fine powder that smells of dry earth and crushed thyme. I remember the heat of those long afternoons, the sun hanging heavy and white over the rugged mountains that separated the Vaccae from the settled lands of the coast. My brothers and I moved through these valleys with a purpose that felt as natural as the flow of the river. Though the water ran cold and swift against our ankles, the Vaccae lived in stone, houses that clung to the hillsides, their walls rough and unyielding, like the men who built them. We did not come with hatred in our hearts, but with the cold necessity of expansion, the need to secure the resources that would fuel a war against a distant and growing power. The attack on the Vaccae was not a sudden storm. but a deliberate tide that rose slowly until it covered the land. We took their cities one by one, not with the frenzy of raiders, but with the methodical precision of architects drawing new lines on a map. The air in their plazas grew thick with the smell of smoke and the low murmur of negotiations that ended in silence. I watched as the young men of the tribe laid down their spears, their shoulders slumping under the weight of a new reality. The ground beneath their feet changed from the soft loam of harvest fields to the hard, packed earth of a garrison post. My brother Hasdrubal stood beside me, his face turned toward the northern horizon, where the Pyrenees rose like a jagged spine against the sky. He was the anchor of my strategy, the steady hand that held the line, while I sought new paths through the unknown. We shared a silence that required no words, a bond forged in the fires of our fathers' teachings and tempered by the long marches across the desert and the mountains. The aristocracy in Carthage watched us with suspicion, their eyes narrowing as our influence grew beyond the walls of the city. They whispered in the shadows of the Senate, fearing a power that could not be contained by their narrow laws or their short memories. They withheld grain and silver, forcing us to rely on the land and the loyalty of the tribes we had conquered. The Pyrenees stood before us in 218 BCE, a barrier of rock and snow that seemed to separate the known world from the realm of myths. Crossing them required a coordination of men, beasts, and supplies that felt like a dance performed on a tightrope. The air grew thin and sharp, stinging the lungs with every breath. We moved slowly, the rhythm of our steps matching the slow heartbeat of the mountains. The Celts who lived in the foothills watched us with a mixture of curiosity and fear, their eyes reflecting the gray light of the high passes. We spoke to them in broken tongues, trading iron and salt for safe passage and fresh guides. These interactions enriched our understanding of the land and the people who walked it, weaving new threads into the tapestry of our strategy. The Romans believed the mountains were an impenetrable wall, a natural fortress that would keep their enemies at bay. They did not see the paths that wound through the high valleys, hidden from the view of their scouts and their maps. The descent into Italy was a trial of endurance, the snow falling in soft, silent flakes that covered the tracks of our elephants. The great beasts moved with a surprising grace, their massive feet finding purchase on the icy slopes where men would have slipped and fallen. The cold was a living thing, biting at the exposed skin and settling deep in the marrow of the bones. We lost many men on that journey, their bodies left behind in the white silence. But the core of the army remained unbroken. The sight of the Po Valley opening up before us was a revelation, a flat expanse of green and gold that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. The air here was warm and heavy, smelling of wet soil and ripening grain. It was a stark contrast to the thin air of the peaks, a reminder of the life that waited below the clouds. The Torini lived in the foothills of the Alps, their village a cluster of wooden huts that huddled together against the wind. We attacked them not out of malice, but to secure our position and demonstrate our strength to the tribes that watched from the shadows. The battle was short and brutal, the clash of bronze on iron echoing off the valley walls. When the fighting ended, the silence returned, broken only by the crackle of the fires and the low moan of the wounded. We took their village and their supplies, a necessary act of survival in a land that offered no mercy to the weak. The swaying of the Celts in northern Italy to our side was a slow and deliberate process, a shift in the wind that carried the scent of change. They saw in us a power that could challenge the Roman legions, a force that promised a new order to the chaos of the peninsula. The Battle of the Trebia River confirmed our reputation as masters of the land, a place where the Romans had believed themselves safe. The river flowed quietly now, far removed from the chaos of the ambush that once unfolded on its banks. The water was cold and swift, hiding the traps and the soldiers who waited beneath its surface. We drew the Roman legions into the trap, their heavy armor a burden in the freezing water. The cry of the elephants rose above the roar of the river, a sound that terrified the horses and the men alike. The victory was absolute, a crushing blow that shook the foundations of Roman confidence in their own invincibility. It was a lesson in the power of terrain, of using the land itself as a weapon against an enemy who relied on rigid formations and predictable movements. The journey continued south, the army moving with a fluidity that confused the Romans and kept them constantly off balance. We learned from every defeat as well as every victory, refining our methods with each campaign. The quiet confidence we displayed in the face of overwhelming odds became a signature trait, a calm that unsettled our enemies more than any display of fury. The war in Spain continued under Hasdrubal after I left for Italy, showing the broader scope of the Carthaginian effort. The destruction of the fleet on the Ebro River demonstrated the vulnerability of our naval power against Roman ingenuity, a lesson that would haunt us in the years to come. The death of the Scipio brothers in 211 BCE was a temporary victory that could not prevent the ultimate Roman triumph. They were brave men, worthy opponents who fought with honor and skill. But the tide of history had already turned against us. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE brought the long struggle to a close with a final, decisive Roman victory. It was a battle of a different kind, fought on open plains where the Roman discipline could shine without the interference of the land. The elephants were driven back, by the trumpets and the spears, their charge broken before it could strike the heart of the enemy lines. The loss was total. The dream of a new empire dissolving into the dust of the African plains. I walked away from the battlefield, the weight of the defeat settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. The legacy of my life was built on this unique blend of strategic foresight and tactical improvisation, a testament to the power of human ingenuity under pressure. A single oil lamp flickers in the corner of a small room, casting long shadows against the whitewashed walls. The flame dances in the draught, painting shifting patterns on the rough stone floor. A wooden bowl sits on a low table, filled with dried figs that smell of sun and earth. The air is still, heavy with the scent of beeswax and the faint aroma of old parchment. Outside, the wind moves through the olive branches, creating a... The mountain air was thin and sharp, cutting through the wool of our cloaks like a cold knife. We had walked for days through the shadow of the Pyrenees, leaving the warmth of the south far behind us. The ground turned from soft earth to jagged stone, each step requiring a deliberate shift of weight. My men stumbled, their boots worn thin by the long march from the coast. The elephants groaned, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the soles of my feet. They were the giants of our army, creatures of immense strength and gentle nature, now burdened by the weight of war. We moved in a slow, winding line, a ribbon of humanity and beast clinging to the side of a cliff. The wind howled through the gaps in the rock, carrying the scent of snow and ancient ice. It was a sound that had not changed in 1,000 years, a constant reminder of the indifference of nature. We paused often, letting the rhythm of our breathing slow down to match the pace of the slowest elephant. The cold seeped into our bones, a damp chill that no fire could fully banish. I watched the leaders of the Gallic tribes, their faces hardened by the climb, their eyes scanning the path ahead with a mixture of fear and determination. They had joined us for the promise of plunder, but the mountain demanded a different kind of courage. It asked for patience, for a stillness of spirit that few possessed. The path narrowed, forcing us to walk in single file, one after another like beads on a string. The roar of a river below was a constant companion, its white water churning against the black rocks. We crossed it on makeshift bridges of stone and wood, our hearts pounding in our chests as we watched the current drag at the supports. The water was ice cold, splashing up to soak our tunics and freeze the hair on our arms. I felt the weight of the oath I had taken as a boy, a promise that had driven me across deserts and seas to this frozen pass. It was not a promise of glory, but a promise of persistence. The mountain did not care for our oaths or our ambitions. It only cared for the strength of the feet that climbed it. We pushed on, driven by the hope of the valley that lay on the other side. The sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The air grew colder, and the wind died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. It was a silence that felt heavy, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. I looked up at the stars, bright and clear against the black sky. They were the same stars that had guided my ancestors across the sea. The same stars that watched over the fields of Carthage. In that moment, the distance between here and home felt vast, a chasm of space and time that separated me from the life I had left behind. Yet there was no longing, only a steady focus on the task at hand. We made camp on a ledge of rock, sheltered from the worst of the wind. The elephants huddled together, their massive bodies providing a wall of warmth against the cold. I sat by the fire, the flames dancing in the darkness, casting flickering shadows on the rock walls. The smell of burning wood and damp wool filled the air, a familiar scent that brought a sense of comfort. My men ate in silence, their movements slow and deliberate, conserving their energy for the day ahead. The snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the ground in a blanket of white. It muffled the sound of our movements, turning the world into a quiet, hushed place. The next morning brought a new challenge, a steep ascent that seemed to have no end. The snow was deep, and every step was a struggle against the resistance of the earth. The elephants slipped, their great feet finding no purchase on the icy slope. We had to stop to dig out paths, to clear the snow from the narrow trail. It was hard work, the kind that tested the limits of human endurance. My hands were numb, the leather of my gloves soaked through with sweat and snow. I felt the ache in my muscles, a deep, throbbing pain that spoke of the toll this journey was taking. Yet, there was a strange clarity in the pain, a focus that came from the sheer necessity of survival. The mountain was a teacher, and it was teaching us the value of every step. We reached a point where the path disappeared entirely, buried under a fresh fall of snow. The air was so cold that our breath froze in the air before it could fall to the ground. We stood there for a long time, looking at the white expanse that blocked our way. The fear was real, a cold knot in the stomach. But it was a fear that could be managed. I looked at my men, their faces pale and determined, and I felt a surge of pride. They had come this far against all odds, and they would not turn back now. We began to dig, our shovels biting into the hard, packed snow. The work was slow, the snow heavy and unyielding. Hours passed, and the sun began to rise, casting a golden light on the white landscape. The snow had a strange beauty in the morning light, sparkling like diamonds under the sun. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, there was a kind of beauty to be found. We dug until the path was clear, a narrow ribbon of dark earth winding up the mountain. The elephants moved forward, their great bodies swaying with the effort. We followed, step by step, the rhythm of our movement becoming a kind of meditation. The air was so thin that each breath felt like a gift, a precious thing to be savored. The silence of the mountain was profound, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. It was a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity, a space where time lost its meaning. We climbed higher, the air growing colder, the wind picking up again. The snow began to fall once more, thick and heavy, obscuring the path ahead. We moved carefully, one hand on the rock, the other on the shoulder of the man in front. The world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next moment. It was a simple existence, stripped of all but the essentials. The fear of falling, the fear of the cold, the fear of the unknown. Yet there was a calm in the face of it all, a quiet acceptance of the danger. We were small against the mountain, but we were not defeated. We were part of the mountain now, moving with it, breathing with it. The climb continued for what felt like days, though it was only hours. The sun moved across the sky, marking the passage of time in a world that seemed timeless. We reached a plateau, a flat expanse of snow that stretched out before us. The wind died down and the silence returned, heavier than before. We stopped to rest, our bodies exhausted, our minds weary. The view from the plateau was breathtaking, a panorama of white peaks and blue valleys. The world below looked small and insignificant, a tiny speck in the vastness of the sky. It was a moment of clarity, a glimpse of the larger picture. The mountain had tested us, and we had passed. The road ahead was still long, but the hardest part was over. We could see the valleys of Italy in the distance, the green fields and the winding rivers, the promise of warmth, of food, of rest. It was a vision that gave us strength, a reason to keep moving. We packed our gear, our movements slow but steady. The elephants were ready, their great eyes fixed on the path ahead. We began the descent, the snow giving way to rock and then to earth. The air grew warmer, the scent of pine and damp soil filling our lungs. The sound of birds returned, a cheerful chirping that seemed alien. After the silence of the mountain, we walked through the forest, the trees tall and dark, their branches heavy with snow. The path wound down the mountain, leading us toward the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The light was soft, casting long shadows that stretched out before us. We reached the edge of the forest, and the valley opened up before us. The fields were green, the air warm and sweet. The sound of water, a gentle stream, filled the air. We had made it. The mountain was behind us, a memory of cold and snow. The road ahead was clear, the path to Italy open. We had crossed the Alps. a feat that would be remembered for generations. The elephants trumpeted, a sound of triumph that echoed through the valley. The men cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of joy and relief. It was a moment of pure happiness, a celebration of survival. I stood there, watching the valley, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. The journey had been long, and the silence here is heavy, different from the silence of the battlefield before the charge. It is a quiet that settles in the bones, a stillness that follows the storm. I sit by the fire, the heat fading slowly, much like the embers of a great empire that once burned bright across the known world. The wind whispers through the olive trees of Bithynia, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. It is a gentle sound, far removed from the roar of elephants and the clash of bronze on iron. In this quiet, the memories do not fade. They simply settle, layer upon layer, like the dust of the Alps or the sand of the Italian plains. I close my eyes, and the darkness is not empty. It is filled with the faces of men who marched with me. The weight of the oath I took as a boy, and the long, winding road that led me from Carthage to the edge of the world and back again. There is no regret in this quiet, only the slow, rhythmic breathing of a life fully lived, a life that sought to reshape the map of the earth. The journey toward Italy began not with a shout, but with the heavy tread of feet on rough stone. We moved through the Pyrenees in the year 218, a vast river of men and beasts flowing against the wind. The mountains were not merely obstacles to be crossed. They were living entities that tested the resolve of every soul in the column. I watched the Gauls in the valley below, their skin painted in blue woad, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed off the granite cliffs. Their presence was a promise of allies, of a people who understood the land as we did. I learned from them how to read the clouds and how to find water in the dry riverbeds. Their tactics were raw and fierce, but they held a wisdom that the rigid legions of Rome could not comprehend. We forged new bonds in the shadow of the peaks, blending their ferocity with the discipline of our African veterans. The crossing was a masterful coordination of will and nature, a dance performed on a stage of ice and rock. The air grew thin as we ascended into the high passes of the Alps. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders and numbing the fingers that gripped the reins. We brought elephants with us, great shaggy giants who moved with a surprising grace through the snow, their breath plumed in the frigid air, white clouds that drifted upward to join the mist. These creatures were not just weapons of war. They were living bridges between the familiar and the impossible. Ancient observers watched in awe as these beasts navigated the treacherous paths, their massive feet finding purchase on the slippery stone. It was a feat that defied the logic of the time, a demonstration that the human spirit could bend the laws of nature to its will. The path was narrow, often no wider than a goat track, and the drop on either side was a bottomless abyss. We moved with a fluidity that confused our enemies, who could not believe such an army could exist in such a place. The descent into Italy was a revelation. The air grew warmer, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The snow gave way to green, grass, and the sound of rushing water. We had visualized a path where others saw only walls of stone and ice. This bold maneuver challenged the very foundations of Roman dominance in the Mediterranean. The legions expected us to sail or march around the coast, but we had come from the sky. The first major victory at the Trebia River confirmed our growing reputation. The river was swollen with the meltwater of the mountains, cold and treacherous. We waited in the shadows of the willow trees, the water numbing our limbs until we felt like statues. When the Roman consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus ordered his men across, they waded into the freezing current, their armor heavy with water. We struck from the banks, a wave of African and Gallic warriors sweeping over them. The Celts of northern Italy, who had watched from the hills, saw the power of our combined strength and turned to support us. Their swords joined ours, and the river ran red with the blood of a defeated army. The Battle of Cannae followed, a masterpiece of tactical synthesis. We commanded a force that was a tapestry of cultures, woven together by the thread of a single vision. The African veterans held the center, their spears steady and their eyes calm. The Gallic warriors, with their long swords and wild courage, formed the wings. The Celtiberian infantry, skilled and disciplined, filled the gaps between them. The Romans marched in their perfect lines, confident in their numbers and their iron discipline. They did not see the trap that lay before them. We let them push into the center, drawing them deeper until the pressure became unbearable. Then the wings folded in, a slow, deliberate motion that turned the Roman formation into a crushing vice. The ground shook under the weight of 55,000 fallen soldiers. It was a catastrophe for Rome, a defeat that would echo through the centuries. The synthesis of our diverse fighting styles created a new form of military art that terrified the legions. They had never seen an army that could move as one, yet fight with the distinct strengths of 100 different peoples. The quiet confidence I displayed in the face of such overwhelming odds became a signature trait. It was not arrogance, but a deep understanding of the rhythm of war. The battle was not a series of chaotic events, but a deliberate composition. We moved with a fluidity that kept the enemy constantly off balance. The supply lines were as crucial as the swords held by the soldiers, and I understood this from the beginning. The logistics of such a campaign required a mind that could hold 1,000 variables in a single thought. We lived off the land, taking what we needed from the fields and the villages, but always with a respect for the people who dwelled there. The Celts in northern Italy became our allies, not just through the sword, but through the shared understanding of what it meant to resist the iron grip of Rome. The war was not linear. It was a series of adaptations to the changing realities of the landscape and the enemy. We learned from every defeat as well as every victory, refining our methods with each passing season. The political landscape of Carthage was a different kind of battlefield, one fought with whispers and shadows. The aristocracy within the city acted as a rival faction, viewing my prolonged campaign with suspicion and fear. They saw my success as a threat to their own power, and they conspired with Rome to remove me when my influence grew too great. They withheld critical supplies and reinforcements, forcing me to rely on local resources and the loyalty of my diverse troops. The accusation that I was plotting with Antiochus III of Syria was a lie, but it reflected the deep distrust held by my political enemies. This accusation came after the war had ended, when I had returned to serve as a statesman. The Senate in Carthage was a place of intrigue, where the fate of a general could be decided by a single rumor. My brother Hasdrubal commanded our forces in Spain for 7 years, holding the line against the Scipio brothers with considerable success. He was my closest collaborator, a man who shared my strategic vision and carried the burden of command on his own shoulders. We maintained a close bond throughout the long conflict, though we were often separated by vast distances and opposing armies. The naval balance shifted when Hasdrubal's fleet was largely destroyed by a surprise Roman attack on the Ebro River in 217 BCE. It was a blow that altered the course of the war, cutting off our connection to the sea. 4 years later, Hasdrubal struck back, crushing the Roman armies and killing the Scipio brothers. He drove the Romans from most of Spain south of the Ebro, a victory that should have changed the tide of the war. But the coordination between our armies was often prevented by the Roman strategy of containing us separately. The campaigns in Spain and Africa formed the broader context for my own operations in Italy, a vast theater of war that spanned the Mediterranean basin. The historical record focuses heavily on the battles and the movements of armies, rather than on the art or literature produced by those who fought. No specific treatises were authored by me, yet my campaigns inspired countless accounts and representations in the centuries that followed. Modern historians continue to analyze my tactics, seeking to understand the ingenuity that allowed a small force to challenge the might of Rome. The legacy of this war is built on the unique blend of strategic foresight and tactical improvisation. The specific facts of my life from the attack on the Vakai to the defeat at Zama, form a coherent and compelling biography. The reception of my achievements in modern scholarship reflects a deep appreciation for the power of the human mind under pressure. The story of my rise and fall continues to captivate those who seek to understand the complexities of ancient warfare. The major works of my life were the campaigns that reshaped the political map of the Mediterranean world. The specific battles I fought and the locations I traversed are now part of the shared cultural heritage of the region. The story of my crossing of the Alps and the use of elephants continues to inspire artists and writers in the modern era. The historical record serves as a reminder of the fragility of power and the enduring nature of human ambition. A small wooden box sits on the shelf before me, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The wood is dark, stained by the oil of my hands and the dust of many roads. It is carved with simple geometric patterns, a design that speaks of a time before the war, a time of peace and craft. Inside the box, there are no treasures of gold or silver, only a few small stones gathered from the banks of the Trebia, and a shard of pottery from a village in the Po Valley. The stones are rough and cold to the touch, their surfaces etched with the marks of the river water. The pottery shard is, the silence here is heavy, different from the silence of the battlefield before the charge. It is a quiet that settles in the bones, a stillness that follows the storm. I sit by the fire, the heat fading slowly, much like the embers of a great empire that once burned bright across the known world. The wind whispers through the olive trees of Bithynia, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. It is a gentle sound, far removed from the roar of elephants and the clash of bronze on iron. In this quiet, the memories do not fade. They simply settle layer upon layer, like the dust of the Alps or the sand of the Italian plains. I close my eyes and the darkness is not empty. It is filled with the faces of men who marched with me. The weight of the oath I took as a boy, and the long, winding road that led me from Carthage to the edge of the world and back again. There is no regret in this quiet, only the slow, rhythmic breathing of a life fully lived, a life that sought to reshape the map of the earth. The path to victory was never a straight line drawn on a map. It was a winding river, often obscured by fog and the mud of difficult terrain. I learned early that isolation was not a punishment but a tool, a necessary space where clarity could emerge from the chaos of war. When the Roman legions pressed close, when the political winds in Carthage turned against me, I found strength in the distance. The generals who relied on the approval of the Senate or the shouts of the crowd often lost their way when the noise grew too loud. I preferred the quiet of the camp, the solitude of the tent where a single lamp burned against the dark. There, The mind could stretch out and touch the edges of the future, seeing what others missed. The world outside was a storm of conflicting demands, but inside the tent there was only the map, the candle, and the plan. I remember the night before the crossing of the Alps, the air biting and cold against my skin. The men huddled around small fires, their faces pale in the flickering light. They looked to me for hope, but I looked to the stars and the mountains that loomed above us like silent giants. The isolation of that moment was profound. We were cut off from the familiar, from the warmth of the cities, from the safety of the known world. Yet, in that separation, a new kind of strength was born. It was the strength of the individual, who must rely only on their own judgment, their own courage, and the trust of those who march beside them. The gods did not speak in thunder then. They spoke in the crunch of snow, underfoot and the steady rhythm of the march. The political structure of my homeland often worked against such clarity. The division of power between the rabbim and the shoftim created a system where every decision was scrutinized, where every move was questioned before it was even made. This internal distrust diluted the force of our state, making it sluggish and reactive. I learned to navigate this by moving faster than the arguments could be formed. When the politicians in Carthage debated the merits of a campaign, I was already on the road, already securing alliances, already adapting to the changing landscape. The distance between the command tent and the council chamber was not just a matter of miles. It was a chasm of understanding. I could not wait for permission to act. I had to act, and then explain or not explain at all. The isolation of command was a heavy cloak, but it was one I wore with purpose. A single woolen cloak, worn thin by years of travel, hangs on the wooden post beside me. The fabric is rough to the touch, dyed a deep indigo that has faded to a soft gray in the corners. It smells faintly of wood smoke and the damp earth of 1,000 campsites. The hem is frayed, the threads unraveling slowly, much like the empire I once hoped to build. I run my fingers over the weave, feeling the texture of the wool, the slight irregularity of the weave where a different hand once worked the loom. It is a simple thing, yet it has kept me warm through the freezing winds of the Alps and the humid nights of the Po Valley. It is a reminder that survival often depends on the smallest details, on the things we carry with us when everything else is stripped away. The cloak does not judge, it simply waits, ready to wrap around the shoulders of the weary traveler. The crossing of the Pyrenees was a testament to the power of isolation as a strategic force. The mountains were a barrier that separated us from the world we knew, a wall of rock and ice that tested every man in the army. We moved through the passes with a silence that was unnatural, a quiet born of necessity and fear. The local tribes watched from the ridges, their eyes tracking our progress. But they could not stop us. We were a force of nature, moving with a fluidity that confused our enemies. I spoke with the Celtic chieftains in their own tongues, forging bonds that would later serve as the foundation of our victory in Italy. These interactions enriched my understanding of the land and the people, expanding the tactical options available to me. The isolation of the mountain pass forced us to rely on our own resources, to improvise solutions to problems that had no precedent. It was a crucible that forged a new kind of soldier, one who could adapt to any terrain, any climate, any enemy. The first major victory at the Trebia River confirmed the value of this approach. The Roman consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, had been wounded in an earlier skirmish at the Ticinus River, and his forces were weakened by the cold and the confusion. I led my men into the freezing waters of the river, using the current and the mud to disrupt their formation. The isolation of the battlefield, the separation from the main Roman army, allowed me to execute a plan that would have been impossible in a more conventional setting. The diverse troops under my command, Africans, Gauls, and Celtiberians, fought with a unity that surprised even me. They moved as one body, a single instrument of war that struck with precision and force. The crushing of the Roman legions at Trebia was not just a military victory. It was a demonstration of the power of strategic isolation. By removing ourselves from the expected patterns of war, we created a new reality, one where the impossible became possible. The human cost of these campaigns was immense, and the isolation of the commander often meant bearing that weight alone. I saw the faces of the dead, the empty eyes of the men who had followed me into the unknown. Their sacrifice was not in vain, but it was a burden that no one else could carry. The political leaders in Carthage could debate the merits of the war from the safety of their halls, but I was the one who had to look into the eyes of the dying and offer them comfort. The silence of the camp at night was filled with the whispers of the ghosts of the past, a chorus of voices that demanded to be remembered. I learned to listen to them, to let their stories guide my decisions. They were the ones who had paid the price for the strategy, and their memory was the only currency that mattered in the end. The art of command is a living thing, evolving with every new challenge, every new isolation. It is not a static set of rules, but a dynamic process of adaptation and growth. I have seen empires rise and fall, and I have learned that the most enduring strength comes from the ability to stand alone, to trust in one's own judgment when the world is against you. The legacy of the Second Punic War is not just in the battles fought or the territories conquered. It is in the lessons learned about the power of preparation and the necessity of adaptability. The historical record preserves these details, but the true lesson is felt in the quiet moments of reflection, in the stillness of the tent where the map is spread out and the future is planned. The world of my time was shaped by these actions, by the strategies employed in the face of overwhelming odds. The influence of these campaigns spread far beyond the borders of Italy, into the annals of history, becoming a beacon of strategic brilliance. The silence here is heavy, different from the silence of the battlefield before the charge. It is a quiet that settles in the bones, a stillness that follows the storm. I sit by the fire, the heat fading slowly, much like the embers of a great empire that once burned bright across the known world. The wind whispers through the olive trees of Bithynia, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. It is a gentle sound, far removed from the roar of elephants and the clash of bronze on iron. In this quiet, the memories do not fade. They simply settle, layer upon layer, like the dust of the Alps or the sand of the Italian plains. I close my eyes, and the darkness is not empty. It is filled with the faces of men who marched with me, the weight of the oath I took as a boy, and the long, winding road that led me from Carthage to the edge of the world and back again. There is no regret in this quiet, only the slow, rhythmic breathing of a life fully lived, a life that sought to reshape the map of the earth. The shadow of Zama stretched long across the final decades of my existence. I returned to Carthage after the great defeat, yet the city remained under the watchful, suspicious eyes of Rome. The air in the Forum had changed. It no longer smelled of triumph and fresh laurel, but of fear and whispered accusations. Those who once cheered my name now feared my growing influence and power. I understood that my role had shifted from a general leading armies to a statesman managing the fragile remains of a broken state. I adapted with the same skill I had shown in war, trading the sword for the scroll. I worked to reform the city, to heal the wounds of a decade of conflict, and to restore the dignity of my people. The Romans watched my every move with deep anxiety. They could not accept that a single man could alter the course of empires through sheer will, and they refused to let me rest. A small statue of a local deity stood on a low shelf in the corner. It watched over the quiet space with a calm, unblinking gaze. The wind whispered through the cracks in the wooden shutters. It carried the distant cry of gulls circling above the water. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of a life fully lived. There was no urgency in the slow passage of time within the room. The lamp flame burned steadily, casting a warm glow on the stone. The sea continued its rhythmic breathing. Beyond the walls of the house, night fell gently, wrapping the small town in a blanket of darkness. The stars appeared one by one in the vast, clear sky above. The room remained still, holding the memory of the man who had passed. The peace treaty imposed by Scipio Africanus had forced me from my home. I could no longer remain in the city that once celebrated my victories. The years of wandering became a quiet testament to my enduring resilience. I traveled across the Hellenistic world seeking new patrons and allies. My presence unsettled the delicate balance of power in the East. Local rulers welcomed me for my reputation and my vast experience. I advised kings on matters of war and statecraft with quiet authority. The world moved on, but the memory of the Punic commander remained. I demonstrated that a single individual could alter the course of empires through sheer will. The quiet determination I showed in the face of adversity remains an enduring inspiration. My story is one of patience, planning, and the careful execution of complex plans. The lessons I learned in youth guided me through decades of conflict and uncertainty. I left behind a legacy that continues to be studied and admired by scholars today. The art of my command was a living thing that evolved with every new challenge. It was a testament to the human capacity for growth and adaptation in difficult times. My life serves as a reminder that even the most daunting obstacles can be overcome. The Romans demanded my surrender. At every turn of my journey, they viewed my continued existence as an unacceptable risk to their security. They feared that my genius might yet revive the Punic threat. I understood that my time was drawing to a close. I knew that I could not live forever as a fugitive in the courts of kings. The slow fate of my life mirrored the slow decline of my city, yet my name remained etched in the annals of military history. The quiet end in a small town contrasted with my dramatic beginnings. I died as I had lived, on my own terms and in control. The world moved on, but the memory of the war lingered. My death closed the book on an era of great conflict and change. The silence that followed was profound and absolute in the ancient world. The air smelled of salt and dried herbs stored in clay jars. A wooden table held a few scrolls and a simple writing stylus. The floor was covered with woven rugs of faded blue and ochre. Shadows stretched long across the room as the sun began to set. The silence was deep and unbroken by any human voice. A small statue of a local deity stood on a low shelf in the corner. It watched over the quiet space with a calm, unblinking gaze. The wind whispered through the cracks in the wooden shutters. It carried the distant cry of gulls circling above the water. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of a life fully lived. There was no urgency in the slow passage of time within the room. The lamp flame burned steadily, casting a warm glow on the stone. The sea continued its rhythmic breathing beyond the walls of the house. Night fell gently, wrapping the small town in a blanket of darkness. The stars appeared one by one in the vast, clear sky above. The room remained still, holding the memory of the man who had passed. The final years were a quiet epilogue to a loud and violent life. I found refuge in various courts, far from the shores of Africa. My life became a series of careful negotiations and diplomatic maneuvers. The Romans could not rest until I was removed from the board. My suicide ensured that I would never be paraded through the streets. The year 183 or 182 BCE marked the end of my journey. The town of Libissa became the final resting place of the great general. History recorded my name with a mixture of fear and admiration. The fall of Carthage was a direct result of my earlier conquests. My story served as a warning to those who challenged Rome. The legacy of Hannibal Barca endured long after my physical death. Scholars continue to study my tactics and my political maneuvers today. The slow fade of my life mirrored the slow decline of my city. Yet my name remained etched in the annals of military history. The quiet end in a small town contrasted with my dramatic beginnings. I died as I had lived, on my own terms and in control. The world moved on, but the memory of the war lingered. My death closed the book on an era of great conflict and change. The silence that followed was profound and absolute in the ancient world. The poison I took was a final assertion of my autonomy. The silence of Libissa swallowed the last breath of the great commander. The sea continued to roll against the shore, indifferent to human affairs. The stars watched over the small town where the legend ended. The night deepened, and the room grew colder in the winter air. The lamp flickered and died, leaving the space in total darkness. The story of Hannibal was complete, yet it would be told again. My life remained a testament to the complexity of ancient warfare. The final years were a quiet epilogue to a loud and violent life. The world found peace, but the memory of the war lingered. My death closed the book on an era of great conflict and change. The silence that followed was profound and absolute in the ancient world. It is a quiet that settles in the bones, a stillness that follows the storm. The wind whispers through the olive trees of Bithynia, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. It is a gentle sound, far removed from the roar of elephants and the clash of bronze on iron. In this quiet, the memories do not fade. They simply settle, layer upon layer, like the dust of the Alps or the sand of the Italian plains. I close my eyes and the darkness is not empty. It is filled with the faces of men who marched with me. The weight of the oath I took as a boy, and the long, winding road that led me from Carthage to the edge of the world and back again. There is no regret in this quiet, only the slow, rhythmic breathing of a life fully lived, a life that sought to reshape the map of the earth. The fire has burned down to a soft bed of gray ash, and the last of the heat rises in faint, dancing columns. The villa at Libissa, where I would draw my final breath, was a small house on the Bithynian coast, far from the warm winds of Carthage, and farther still from the camps of Italy. King Prusias had taken me in as a guest, but a guest the Romans were learning to find. The Senate had sent envoys to demand my surrender, and Prusias, weighing the cost of his hospitality against the cost of Roman anger, would not refuse them long. The poison I carried in a hollow ring on my finger was a small thing, prepared decades earlier, kept for the day when Roman justice would come to my door. The Roman name for that justice would later be deditio, the formal handing over of an enemy I had no intention of being handed. The vial was cold against my skin in the early morning when the soldiers gathered outside the gate. Such was my last act of generalship, to deny them the chase, to spare myself the long and humiliating march through Italian streets that would have followed. The Romans did not stop fearing me when I died. The phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal at the gates, settled into the city like a draft that no shutter could close. Mothers used the words to quiet their children long after my body had been wrapped in linen on a foreign hillside. 50 years later, the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus stood on the smoking ruins of Carthage in the year of its destruction, and is said to have wept, quoting Homer on the fall of cities. The Senate had voted in the end to scrape the soil and salt the earth so that no city would rise again on that ground. They had been thorough because they had been afraid. The fear of me had outlived me by half a century, and only when the city itself was gone did the Senate begin to sleep without checking its weapons by the door. The first careful telling of the wars came from a Greek who arrived in Rome as a hostage and stayed as a friend. Polybius walked the Italian roads I had walked, climbed the Alpine passes I had crossed, spoke with Roman senators who had stood as boys against my legions, and wrote a history that was neither flattery nor curse. He had served beside Scipio Aemilianus at Carthage and had seen the smoke with his own eyes. His histories, written in Greek for an audience of educated Greeks, who wanted to understand how Rome had risen so quickly, set down the campaigns of the Punic War with a careful hand. He read the bronze inscription I had ordered placed at Cape Licinium in southern Italy, the inventory of my forces in the languages of Carthage and Greece, and he copied its numbers into his pages without his work. The truth of what had happened might have softened over time into songs and warnings. With it, the wars survived as something one could study, not only fear. The encirclement at Cannae became, in the centuries after, a lesson taught to young soldiers in language, schools that did not exist when I lived. The double envelopment of a numerically superior force, the deliberate weakening of the center to draw the enemy deep into a trap, the cavalry sweeping back from the wings to close the iron jaws, generals who would never read Greek, and who had never seen an African elephant, studied the diagrams of that single afternoon. A Prussian field marshal in the 19th century would write of Cannae as if it were a verb. Officers in the United States War College in the early 20th century would assign it as required reading. Plans for great campaigns drawn on maps of Europe and Asia would carry the shape of two horns closing on a center, a shape first set down on Italian soil on a hot August morning in the year 216 before the Common Era. The blood and the dust of that day were long gone, but the geometry remained, traced again and again on the boards of war academies. That did not even know the names of my Numidian riders. In the place where Carthage stood, a different city stretches now, under the modern sun. Travelers walk over Roman ruins built on Punic foundations buried beneath them. The layers of two civilizations folded together by the patience of time. A museum near the harbor holds bronze coins struck with elephants on their reverse, the symbol of my father's house in faint relief. Scholars from many countries crouch in the dust at the Tophet, the burial ground of the city's earliest centuries, brushing soil from broken urns with small soft tools. The sea is still the same sea. The light on the white walls of the houses still has the same hard clarity that I remember from boyhood mornings. A small bronze statue of an elephant, recovered from a sunken galley off the Sicilian coast, stands now in a glass case in a quiet room. Visitors lean toward it and read the small printed card and try to imagine what such a creature looked like crossing a snow pass. They are kind in their imagining. The elephants suffered greatly. The card does not mention this. The lamp in my own room has burned low. The wind moves slowly through the cypress branches outside the window, a sound that has accompanied me through many sleepless nights. A boy in a city far from this coast will read of Cannae in a book one evening and put the book down and look at the ceiling for a long time. A young officer will trace the diagram of the double envelopment on a sheet of paper and feel the cold elegance of it without understanding the cost. A historian working at a desk in a winter library will turn over a fragment of